Family law is about people, not paperwork. Trusted by thousands of UK firms, Leap's legal software gives family lawyers a single, fully integrated platform to scale your practice, stay compliant, and deliver better client outcomes. Learn more at leap.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Family Lawyer podcast. Delighted to welcome you back from the summer break with a very special edition and a very special guest on today's podcast. We've got Graeme Fraser on. Graeme is a partner and head of family at William Sturges, but more importantly and most pertinently for the conversation today, I think it's fair to say a campaigner, Graeme, on cohabitation reform. It's finally here. The whole discussion today is going to be about cohab reform. But perhaps before we start, for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with you, and I can't imagine there are many, but perhaps you might start with a little bit about yourself and your role both at William Sturges, and of course you hold various roles at Resolution as well.
Hello, David, and thank you very much for inviting me to your podcast. So just a little bit about me. I have been a solicitor for 3 decades now, and I work at William Sturges in central London, and I'm head of family and a partner there. I have various roles at Resolution. I'm probably best known for being chair of Resolution's Cohabitation Committee. So I've been leading that campaign for over 10 years, but I've been involved with it probably for around 20 to 25 years officially. And I also am a director of Resolution because I sit on their national committee and a member of the Family Law Reform Group. I sit on various other committees, but I'm very heavily involved with that group. Another role that I carry out is that I am a member of the Financial Procedure Rule Committee. In that role, on the Financial Procedure Rule Committee, I deal with secondary legislation. So during that time, I was involved with the rollout implementation of no fault divorce.
Comprehensive, to say the least, Graeme, and the perfect person to talk today about the cohabitation reform consultation that was launched by the now former government, I suppose, Sir Keir Starmer's government, now Andy Burnham's government, and perhaps there's some interesting dynamics to explore there. I got on my high horse recently on social media, and I looked at the demographic of audiences that we have as a group, as today's media. We have residential conveyancing, today's wills and probate, which covers wills, tax, trust, probate, estate planning, and family law. And the legal landscape for all of those areas of law is undergoing some pretty seismic changes at the moment. You've got a home buying and selling consultation that the government have responded to recently. We've had the Law Commission's work on redrafting wills law that goes back to 1837. And of course, we have this cohabitation reform consultation as well. It is a really interesting time to be a legal practitioner. It's never more important than now to keep on top and abreast of updates that ultimately affect practitioners or have the potential to affect practitioners on a day-to-day basis. Graeme, you said that you've been a long time campaigner around this. You obviously knew the cohabitation consultation was coming, but what was your initial reaction to the news that it was going to be here and that we were going to have the opportunity to respond to it?
I think it's fair to say, David, I've lived and breathed this for many years in the lead up to it as well. And Resolution, we've been working for a long time in our campaign. We also have a very good connection with the Ministry of Justice, and we met with the former Minister, Alison Levitt, KC. So we knew that this was coming. When it finally did appear, we were probably a little bit surprised. And I'd like to say pleasantly surprised a surprise, because I think it was quite clever what was done and what was intended, because rather than just focus on one bit of legislation, which is cohabitation reform, which has desperately needed reform for over 40 years, the government's decided to take a wider view and look at financial remedies on divorce, nuptial agreements, cohabitation opt-outs, and there's also an overlapping consultation on weddings law. So I think the government has taken on a very bold and ambitious plan to remedy the law. And I think what was very clever about the consultation was that it was written very well, and it's very joined up. It's very easy to follow, very easy to understand for a member of the public to understand it. Probably easy to access through AI. I suspect something like that was behind it. And so it's quite easy to get to grips with the concepts quickly. And I think what the government want to do is to ensure that there is a law that is more easily accessible, easier to understand, and that people can get to grips with what they need to do if their relationship breaks down or if they're forming a relationship. That doesn't mean not using a lawyer, but people having laws that they can understand better has got to be a good thing, I would say, for society. And I think that was the thread that was going through it. And we can go into the concepts probably a little bit later on and be specific about it, but I could see what the clear intent is. And I think that it is important to modernise the law and, go along with how society is today. We're now a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and we have laws there that are many years old. The laws that do exist, along with laws that don't exist. So the area is ripe for reform. A lot of people will have to access this law in reality when it happens, because unfortunately people break up quite a lot, but also people form relationships. So it's a really important thing for our society, our public, and society at large, not just in terms of going to court or finalising things, but everyday activities like opening bank accounts, transferring mortgages, doing things with your insurance policy. And I think it's a very clever initiative that the government has undertaken, and they've taken the wider picture as opposed to focusing in on the technical stuff that lawyers tend to think about every day, but they've taken a wider view. So I actually applaud the initiative that was taken there.
The proposals obviously mirror the work of the Law Commission in this space, and that has been a very long process as well. The Law Commission has looked at this over the last few years. Was there anything that the Law Commission had kind of talked about that you felt was missing out of this consultation, or do you think that the consultation goes far enough in terms of some of its recommendations?
Well, I think we had some fears going into this, because the Law Commission document is not a full document when it comes to financial remedies, whereas the Law Commission report back in 2007 is a very full summary. But essentially, the way the government has grappled with this is to look at existing laws and existing case law, codify that law, and try and simplify the language a bit so that people, when they come to negotiate, they understand what they're talking about. Now, there are still some issues, for example, working out what needs are that we'll need to grapple with. So it's not completely simple, but they're trying to really meet the Law Commission's objectives there, because I think what the Law Commission found was that the reality is that we have a statute, the Matrimonial Causes Act, and you can see the statute, but the case law that's evolved, nobody would understand what the case law is by looking at the statute. And clearly that statute is out of date. And what they've also done is that they've interwoven that with cohabitation law, because cohabitation law under these proposals will have financial remedies in family law, which it hasn't really had in the past. So I think that was the underlying objective, and I think the endeavour behind that was good.
The detail of the consultation, and I'm probably, like you, would urge practitioners to respond to the consultation. But the detail kind of covers reforming, as you say, laws on financial remedies, reforming law on cohabitation, on separation, and thirdly, reforming the law on cohabitants in cases of intestacy. I'm not going to cover intestacy particularly today, but the specifics of dealing with financial remedies on divorce are really interesting, because there are various models that were proposed originally, and the consultation seems to have landed on this codification plus model. You can't see the inverted commas on a podcast. What does that mean, and what are the implications for practice?
Well, what they've done is they've taken the case law over about 25 years and they have applied modern language, not necessarily the wording that came out of case law, which actually sometimes is difficult to understand. I don't think the judges, when they write up the judgment, or the people who write the judgments, necessarily think about how it looks to the public. But they've made an attempt to do that. So, you know, we're looking at primarily the concepts of sharing and needs. I think those were the two key concepts that will appear in new legislation. There is the other concept called compensation, which does appear from time to time, but that is not the focus of these proposals. And in the vast majority of cases, when it comes to financial remedies, get determined on sharing and needs. So there was an attempt to also further define needs by bringing in this sort of three-stage hierarchy and, you know, attempting to give examples in terms of wording to needs. But essentially those are the principles. And there's also an attempt at what we call matrimonialisation, which is a bit of a tongue twister. But that is basically talking about what property is part of the matrimonial assets and which part are non-matrimonial. And that's important as well, because when it comes to nuptial agreements, that's what we do. Nuptial agreements are there to separate a property that will otherwise be matrimonial. So it's a genuine attempt to do that. And it also lays the foundation by defining those terms and by defining those remedies and attempting to do it in a more simple way in terms of being easy to understand. It then provides the foundation for the development of cohabitation law based on needs. And that to me, I think, was one of the big surprises, probably a bit of a gasp moment when I read this a couple of days before it was released. And I was reading it late into the night, and I saw they were going to have the difference model. So the difference between financial remedies and cohabitation was going to be based on needs and not on compensation. And compensation was what had been recommended in the Law Commission report back in 2007. I don't think anyone actually saw that coming. So I think that was the big surprise.
The second element of the consultation, as you say, looking at what happens on separation. Now, currently, despite what major insurance providers would have you believe, of course, there is no common law spouse. We've talked about this before, haven't we, Graeme, where if you, on the drop down menus, when you renew your car insurance, there is a common law spouse option, unbelievably. I mean, this is long overdue. And as you say, at the moment, a real mishmash of, not even legislation, really, just precedent, isn't it?
I think the thing about this that's interesting for me, David, is where is this coming from? Where is this initiative? And the government, when it was then out of government and it published its election manifesto, talks about protection of unmarried women. And we translate that into protection from domestic abuse. Now, where the momentum has come from is that there is a greater understanding of what domestic abuse is nowadays. There's been a new definition which includes coercive and controlling behaviour. And following a select committee report, and I gave evidence to that select committee, which actually focused on some of this. It was found, and through resolution research, that it's women who are most unprotected under the current law. And that was where the energy was coming from. But the other point that you're making there is that people don't understand what their remedies are, is what we call the common law marriage myth. And there have been consistent surveys, which are rich surveys, so British social attitude surveys, which consistently show that a very large proportion of the population don't know what their rights are. And the ones who have the greatest ignorance are the ones who are most likely to be affected. So they're in the age group where they're forming relationships and they're going to have children. So that common misunderstanding has been something that it's not been possible to resolve. And academics have said it's not going to be possible to resolve. And you may ask, well, how people can learn about the new law? And that might be something we talk about. But clearly the difficulty with that is that you have a situation where somebody comes in to see you and you can't help them because the way the law is based on what happened when they decided to buy a property, which might have been 20 years ago, and then what they might have written in a WhatsApp message or what they may have said in a coffee shop before they went into the lawyers to sign papers. And they didn't know that 20 years later that intention was going to be the end of it. And sometimes it is. And that clearly is unfair because at the same time, we've had financial remedies case law developing, which looks into greater equality between a couple. So cohabitation law was way behind, and it's now affecting at least 20% of the population, 20% of the population in coupled relationships. I believe it could be up to 25% actually. And the figures fluctuate from time to time. Huge amount of people are affected, and we're now living in a society where I believe the majority of children when they're born are to unmarried mothers. So it's affecting a significant band of the population. And as I said, the practical point about this is without legislation in force, people have difficulty getting eligibility to benefits, getting housing. It does cause problems in employment all across the field. So all this stuff is extremely important. And with a greater understanding of the domestic abuse issues, we're looking at people who are in and out of relationships, in and out of homes, and they can't actually get on with their lives. And what I'm really hopeful is that this legislation will make it easier for people to move on when they break up, and also when they form relationships, they'll be more informed about what they have to do. And I'm saying all this aside from how they would use their legal rights in practice, because one of the great things about modernising the law is that it will make the process much easier to use non-court dispute resolution processes. When those processes work well, and I don't say they should be simplified to it's 50-50 and that's it. It is a bit more nuanced than that. But when it works well, it's going to work more fairly because the principles behind it are fairer, so people can move forward. As the law stands at the moment with cohabitation rights, because the law does not give couples the rights you would expect them to have, which in some cases are what would happen on divorce, but we're looking at a different model here because they don't have any rights at all. When you try to negotiate, you're there with your hands behind your back, and it's actually very difficult to get these cases resolved unless you've got good lawyers and good people around. Those are probably the cases I see, but there's probably a huge number of people who don't even get to that situation.
Oh, hugely, and people who don't realise they've got that opportunity either. There are some fantastically difficult definitions to arrive at within this consultation. And again, interestingly, some requests for feedback on this. But let's take, for example, the protections would apply to couples in a committed romantic relationship for a period of at least 3 years. I mean, take your point, we find it difficult enough already to establish when the starts of relationships are. This is going to become really, really important in the context of these sorts of claims, isn't it? Even more so than perhaps it is now. There are exceptions for people who've got children, so the protections apply the child immediately. This has the potential to be a real banana skin for the legislation, as far as I can see. Is that your view?
I don't think so, because I gave evidence to the select committee. I think you know when people are cohabiting when you see it. I don't think it's the sort of thing people lie about. I think people who are in a couple, you can see that. And I don't think they fight about that. There can be arguments about when it began and when it ended, but the fact they're in a relationship is usually quite easy to discern. I do think that there will be litigation about the number of years and about whether they were cohabiting, because I understand it happens in Inheritance Act claims more, because there are rights there. But I don't think it's a banana skin. I think that what actually happens is that when a relationship breaks down, there is something to be dealt with, and they're more invested in dealing with what they need to deal with rather than whether they're actually cohabiting. I don't really recall ever actually having a client where it was queried whether they were cohabiting or not. Actually, it was more about sorting the situation out. That's what they've got a problem. That's why they've come to see me. If they could sort it out, they wouldn't come to see me. That explains why I get difficult cases, or why I believe I get difficult cases. So I don't think it's that. The eligibility is relevant, and it's relevant for a number of reasons. Where you're looking at eligibility, it is different to if you get married. If you get married, you are entering into a contract and you know that you're doing that. With cohabitation, the path can be a little bit different. You could go from living as, I don't know, property sharers, getting into a morphing into a relationship, then actually having children, then moving between properties, then buying properties. So the relationship changes, but the status of the relationship hasn't caught up. Now, it's those people who get caught somewhere down the road and their relationship breaks down, and they're the people who need help. Probably usually more often than not when there's property involved. And that's what they don't have at the moment. But the number of years that they have lived together is significant, because when you have a cut-off point, that will cut off the numbers who can apply under this legislation. And I think we have to be very careful about that, because if the numbers is set too high, so for example, I know that there was a wrecking amendment attempt in the Lord Leicester bill to try and make that 10 years. Well, if you did something like that, then you'd have the same problem that you've got now with Schedule 1. You'd have legislation that no one can access, which is a little bit of a waste of time. So the figure of 3 years feels to me about right, because after 3 years, people, whatever you've done for 3 years, that's usually established as something. So that's meaningful to me. I don't favour the use of the word romantic, because I think romantic means different things to different people. Actually, if you said to someone, let's go on a romantic weekend, they probably have different views of what that is, right? But I do think that committed relationships is important. I think the word enduring is important. There's definitely a meaning behind that. I am a little bit concerned about the word stability, because that's not guaranteed. A couple could get into a relationship that could become abusive, and therefore it might become unstable, and you might have a situation where a partner leaves the home to try and get out of being controlled, and then goes back and then leaves, and they're sort of yo-yoing around. And those are patterns that we see, because increasingly people will share that and talk about that. So but I think the best way to go is that there'll be a checklist by way of guidance of what is cohabitation, and I think the government's worked quite well with that list. We've got some suggestions for adding to that list, but it would probably be better to give more information than less information, because then there would be greater guidance about what it is.
It's interesting to see that, for example, the consultation indicates that the needs principle would be different in a cohabitation case as it would be in a marriage. There still seems to be this favoritism towards marriage. Is that right? I mean, given what you've said about the number and increasing number of cohabiting couples and life choices that people make now to not get married. I mean, it's a very conscious choice, isn't it, to not get married? We need to recognize that as much as people who still see marriage as important.
I think, David, that's the reason why this is a consultation. It's not fixed in stone. I think one of the things people do is they look at this and say, oh, this is the new law. It's not. It's actually got about 48 questions in it. So the government have dropped some ideas or some principles, and they've written the model. So we can regard this as the model. It's the difference model. And as I understand it, it's not going to be rewritten. So people who wanted to have the same rights as people who are married, that's not on the table. So the principal difference is between having sharing available to people who divorce. So that's, I suppose you want to take it 50-50, but it also is a bit more nuanced than that, as we know, because we have to look at asset classes and the needs model. And it's clear that sharing is not available to cohabitants. That is the clearest difference. Now, what this paper does is it takes needs one step further, and it puts it into 3 tiers, and it gives example of higher level needs. So I think, they're referring to luxury items. Now, I have looked at case law about this, and there is reference sometimes to needs being at higher level. And what they're saying is that shouldn't be something that cohabitants get. Now, the reason for that is that the belief system behind this model is that somebody shouldn't be better off as a result of living together than had they been married. And that is a clear difference, because you make a decision to get married. It's a different thing where you cohabit, but that's where the legal model is settled. In reality, and this is a matter for politicians, it's not just for lawyers, but my understanding of it is that higher level needs would apply in the very high net worth cases. So what we call the ultra high net worth cases, the kind of stuff that you read about in the papers, the high level divorces. Most cases in this country find that it's a combination of sharing and needs. In reality, most cases are determined by needs. It's been said that needs are relevant in cases of assets of 10 to 15 million. So not many people get over that. But what a government are trying to avoid is high level cohabitants suddenly having better rights than if they were married. And that's the thinking behind it. Now, how that all plays out in practice, I think is still to be determined. I think that it was a genuine and sincere attempt to define needs, to make it something that people can understand better. But the practical application of that's going to be different, because there are different people have different cars and people have different holidays, and I think the overall marker is standard of living. So the standard of living that the couple had during that relationship is a drive towards what needs they have. And I think that is a safer way to look at it. So it may be a question of looking at that criteria and examining how that looks in legislation. So that's the practical implications of that, which we're best placed as lawyers to talk about, because we deal with these cases every day.
I think one of the other things that I want to say concerned about, and I use that a little lightly, but given the context of what we've talked about in terms of domestic abuse and coercive control, there's also this provision for opt-out in the consultation. Now, I think there's a lot of very sensible reasoning behind why people might want to opt out of it, but there is this sort of voice in the back of our head, isn't there, as family lawyers, thinking to ourselves, well, does opting out actually create an opportunity for people who are conducting domestic abuse to continue to do that within cohabiting relationships without any recourse?
So I think there are two things going on here. One is the law and regulating the law and creating certainty. And I would say that's generally a good thing. If people know what the law says, then they understand their rights better. This is what we haven't had with Talata in Schedule 1 particularly. So that is a good development. The other way is, how do you marshal it? How do you service it? And I think it's probably a combination of both. I do absolutely agree that you should have the ability to opt out, because when you start living with someone, you don't actually enter into a contract. When you marry someone, you do. That is something that you've had to do. So the concept of opting out is entirely correct. And I think there should be two types of opt-outs. One is the full opt-out, and the other is what I would call a sort of bespoke or partial opt-out. The second one is something we're already familiar with, because people enter into cohabitation agreements, cohabitation separation agreements, compromise agreements. These are formal documents that lawyers apply. But the opt-out system is basically, I'm fully opting out of this law when I'm with you, because I don't want to be a part of that. And that is something I know that there will be groups who are concerned about risk there. I personally have a view on this. I think the world has evolved from the times when you go to stationers, pick up a piece of paper and sign it. We're living in a paperless society. I think it should be possible to enter into an agreement like this, register it on the government gateway so people know what you've done, and then you should have the option to have legal advice on it. And I think if you have legal advice at the time, it makes that opt-out agreement stronger, less likely to fail for what we would call manifest unfairness. But then I think it's up to the legal sector to do better, and other sectors of society, when it comes to monitoring domestic abuse. So what I'm talking about here is better screening tools being used, and then better safeguarding being used. And I think that it would be possible, entirely possible, through secondary legislation and guidance and probably governance for whoever is providing this advice to do the necessary work. What is not realistic is to expect basic statute, because I think the statute would actually be a lot less technical than lawyers are expecting. I think it will be quite simple law that's written down, so it's easy to understand. What we can't expect is that new legislation in itself is going to be a cure for domestic abuse. It is up to society as a whole to do a lot better. And I think there are signs of that. For example, David, on my way to work, I've seen in underground stations a poster for a well-known insurance company which talks about someone saying, I'll look after the finances. That's actually controlling behaviour. Here's the telephone number if you're bothered by it. And so there are signs in the financial sector that people are picking up on this, and it's happened in other countries. So I think it's society as a whole dealing with this legislation. But opt-out agreements, they should be allowed, but I think they will work better if you've got the legal advice, and the legal advice is done in the right way. It's always has been down to the practitioner to get the legal advice right. So it's down to us.
A half an hour podcast is a really challenging amount of time to go through what is as you've said, a proper comprehensive review of family law, really outside of domestic abuse. And you've made the point, of course, that changing or reforming cohabitation without some of the other bits that the consultation includes would kind of be a little bit pointless. So it's a really challenging topic to get through. We are moving towards the end of the time we have together. Before I let you go, I wanted to get your insight into nuptial agreements, because they are an interesting part of the consultation, aren't they? In the context of financial remedies, they're sort of saying that they could become a bigger part of the decision process. I mean, it's interesting to see how nuptial agreements have developed, really, particularly over a reasonably short amount of time as well, because there is definitely case law and precedent that takes account of them, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, without question, if people enter into nuptial agreements nowadays, certainly since the case of Radmacher, which was 16 years ago now, then the chances are they're probably going to be held to the agreement unless there's something really unfair or someone's left in a predicament of real need or something didn't go well at the time the document were executed. And I think what's been attempted here is to try and codify the law so that people understand better what they're getting into. And there are a number of concepts at play here. There are the Radmacher concepts, but I think they're put into simpler English. And there's also something that's very familiar, which are qualifying nuptial agreements. And qualifying nuptial agreements feature in the consultation itself. And we've been mulling this over, and I think one wouldn't want to be prescriptive about certain things because you don't want to create a cliff edge, in particular regarding the number of days in which you execute these agreements before you get married. I do think that it would be sensible to try not to get these agreements signed on the eve of a wedding, because I genuinely do believe in the concept of cold feet. I've seen that professionally, and I've known friends who have gone through it, and I think that's not the best time to be considering these documents. So the pressure behind that's important, but I think certain safeguards for these agreements to work are important. And there's all manner of these sorts of agreements, David. You can get one. I've had them settled by King's Council at a very high level, international, involving about 4 jurisdictions. But I also understand it's possible to go on to something called a wean-up, probably pay a couple of £100, and if you get it right, it'll probably work. So there's a lot of scope for how these things may work in the future. We don't know, for example, how AI tools might work. So these agreements may become very accessible to people in the future. So it is important to have the safeguards. I do think it's right to be part of statute. I do think it will keep cases out of court. And the most important thing is it will give a couple autonomy so they can decide what they want to happen if the relationship breaks down. And it can save a lot of heartache and a lot of expense and potentially confusion if the relationship breaks down. And it's not let's be honest, it's not very pleasant going to lawyers or getting someone to make a decision for you.
I think greater certainty around nuptial agreements is really interesting. Before we finish, and I want to ask you about the change of government as well, you made a really valid point right at the start of the discussion about the onus on government, on the legal sector, to educate the public about these changes if and when they are to happen. There is a huge exercise to be done there, isn't there, in terms of updating people on what they need to know about, their cohabitation rights if and when legislation is passed. We're very bad at that as a sector, and I think we're very bad at that as a in the UK at large. We simply do not educate the public about legal services. I don't know how we're going to get around that though.
Well, I think we're looking at the situation now, and then we're looking at the situation with the new law. So my view is that you have three things going on. One is law. You have to have law. You have to regulate society. You can't just let areas of the law run free, and cohabitation is one of them because it makes a massive difference to couples and most importantly to their children. So we need regulation. Then you need education, and education is difficult for the entire country, and then you need awareness. Now, it's been shown that we're not going to be able to cure the common law marriage myth through awareness alone. And that's the reason why there was a select committee report, and that's the reason why we've got this consultation, and that's the reason we're going to get new law. But with fairer laws and with new laws, what can we do? Well, I think there is quite a lot we can do, but I think we also have to be honest about what we're not going to do. What I don't think we're going to see are adverts over every bus shelter and railway station and illuminations or goodness knows what, because there isn't the money for it. There isn't the money for much at the moment, as you know. So we have to be honest about that. But what we can do are several things. So certainly within the family law sector, we will be points of information for the public, and we will liaise with other people such as Citizens Advice Bureau and so forth, where people get legal information. So there's information hubs that we can assist with. But I think the government can do quite a lot. And also there are key points in the relationships. For example, registration of a birth. And if this is done online, that can trigger information being sent out. Also, when a property is purchased, I'm afraid I don't rely on conveyancing lawyers to provide this information. There's lots of law reports proving that. But if you register a property in someone's name, or even if you enter into a tenancy agreement, I see no reason why you can't have information being sent to couples or families at that point. I think the third area, which is more nuanced and difficult to apply, but requires enthusiasm, is public information. So you talked about social media. I can't say I sit there scrolling Instagram, but I believe a lot of people do. There are things that come out in Instagram, and there are ways of disseminating information. But I see it really in two ways. First of all, it could be champions and influencers saying, look, there's this new law, here's a guide to it, this is what it means. You know, an example of that would be somebody like Martin Lewis, who we know is always in the media when there's a change, there's some fiscal change. So people like him would be important. And then on top of that, I think there are financial sectors, and I think financial sectors could be encouraged. So to give you an analogy, David, when the issue with the war happened and there was concern about petrol prices, Number 10 asked all the fuel suppliers to come and have a meeting not to overcharge on petrol. So we know that they can have governance. So I don't see any reason why the government or the powers to be can't get collectives of insurance providers, banks and so forth to meet and agree some sort of protocol. Now, in a way, that's already happening because there is an initiative to reduce domestic abuse through something called UK Finance. But the problem we were talking about earlier about the common law marriage coming up in insurance forms, I think that's something that we can take a bit of responsibility for, but I think we should put that on the private sector to do better. And I think there is a positive spin on that, because we can say, well, there's new law. This is, think about this product, think about that. It's not for me to sell products, but I think some of the negative steer out there, which is, people getting rights they shouldn't have, that's not what this is about. It's about people accessing services due to the fact that they now have rights that they understand are on a fairer footing. So a lot of all of this, David, is not about the new law. It's about how you apply the new law. And I think that's going to be the significant thing going forward.
Oh, no, I absolutely agree. And just to finish off the discussion, Graham, this consultation was launched under Sir Keir Starmer's government. It closes under Andy Burnham's government. It was, as you said, in the Labour election manifesto. I guess, do you still feel confident, given, the political machinations, that there is appetite for this reform to continue, and we may well see reform and cohabitation reform in the next 12, 18, 24 months?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've lived in a country for at least 10 years where we've had 7 prime ministers. So there's been a lot of political turbulence for many years. New laws do happen. No fault divorce happened, the domestic abuse legislation happened, and the revocation of the assumption of parental involvement. There are things that change. Family law does change. It changes best when there's consensus. Am I concerned about the amount of time? Well, we're sort of getting towards about halfway through the 5-year term. I think there has been considerable work and investment done by the government, the Ministry of Justice in particular, and they've carried out an impact assessment. They've carried out 2 detailed consultations. They've liaised with the main stakeholders, including resolution, and there's now a public consultation. I think it would be a great shame and a great waste of resources if this was scrapped. But the fact that the intention behind this legislation is primarily to protect women who have been domestically abused, and also putting the interests of children's welfare as the priority, I would say it should be a no-brainer, and I would be surprised if the new Prime Minister thought any different. The issue, David, is parliamentary time and events, because unfortunately reform does proceed at a slow pace. I would very much hope that once the wedding law consultation closes, because the 2 consultations are linked, that's on I believe the 25th of September, the government then have about a 1 to 2 month period to consider all of this, that we would be seeing an announcement somewhere around the turn of the year. I don't want to get quoted on that, but I hope it won't be too long. I do think the momentum is there. I do think the fact that the weddings law consultation was published on the last day of the Starmer administration is significant. And I think people in the sector just need to have faith in the work that's been done. I think a tremendous amount of work has been done behind the scenes, and I have done a lot of driving of it as well. And I'm living and breathing this thing, and I do want to make it a reality, because I do think that we owe it to ourselves and our society to create a fairer and simpler system of laws so that we can actually resolve problems for people. And that will take pressure off the courts. It will take pressure off services. It is a good thing to be doing, and it's worthy of the time that's needed. And you know, how many people are going to pass through family law at some point in their lives? Anybody who enters into a relationship or ends a relationship will be involved, or should I say, anybody will know someone who is going through a relationship breakdown or forming a relationship or going. So it just covers such a wide area of subjects that I think the reform is long overdue, and I don't think it should just be sort of dusted off. Now, what happens politically, I can't tell you. We're in a period of high volatility, but it is a government with a very significant majority, and we haven't seen that for a very long time. So during, if this government lasts the full term, the time is available to do it. We probably won't get it implemented, but I am hopeful of enactment. And as I say, I think it's a very positive thing, and we should be proud of it. And actually, for the people who want it to happen, it's extremely important to get behind it and support it.
Graeme, it's been fantastic to have you on the podcast, and I really appreciate you spending some time going through some of the detail of the discussion, as well as some of the context as well. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much.
The Today's Family Lawyer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk. My thanks to Graeme. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.